Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another episode of Time Warp. This is a series where I talk about features or things that were removed from the game for one reason or another, and in this video, I want to talk about the original Naxxramas 40-man raid from vanilla. This was the least seen raid in the game because it was removed and re-released when the Wrath of the Lich King expansion came out. It had some very unique and interesting items, and to this day, people still search for ways to somehow access it. So, in this video, I'll talk about the pre-release Scourge Invasion event, the attuning process, and of course the actual raid, and reminisce a bit. So, let's first talk about the events leading up to it. Not counting Onyxia or any of the 20-man raids, this was the fourth major raid of vanilla. We initially had the Molten Core at release, the Blackwing Lair after that, and then the Temple of Ankh-Kiraj. By the time the temple rolled around, they were doing special launch events tied to the raids. For AQ40, both the Horde and Alliance had to work together and gather supplies to open the gates, and when they did, a huge event launched in the Silithus zone. The equivalent for the Naxxramas raid was the Scourge Invasion event, but instead of being tied to a single zone, this event was spread out to 6 separate high-level zones. The Burning Steppes, the Blasted Lands, Teneris, Ashara, Winterspring, and the Eastern Plague Lands. These zones would have giant structures called necropoli assaulting the area, and your goal was to fight them off. An undead horde would be directly under them, guarding something called a necrotic shard. You would kill these undead to weaken the shard until some acolytes came down to heal it. If you used some necrotic runes, a special item tied to this event, it would summon a giant level 70 elite wraith. Killing it would destroy the shard and award you with the Argent Dawn rep, more necrotic runes, and a chance to get a piece of armor from a special undead slaying set tied to this event. These were blue sets that give you some bonuses against undead mobs. Visually, they didn't look too impressive though. There were 3 shards per necropolis, and destroying them would take down the necropolis as well, and temporarily end the invasion for that zone. So, it was mainly an event for max levels only. Lower levels did get to see the occasional undead pop up in the major cities, Stormwind for Alliance and Undercity for Horde, but for the most part, it was tuned for level 60s. But the main highlight of this whole event was of course Naxxramas. This was the home of the Lich, kel'thuzad, who already made his mark in other areas of the world at this point. He used to be a mage of the Kirin Tor, but at some point he fell under the influence of the Lich King and he founded the Cult of the Damned, a group everyone was familiar with in vanilla. They were all over the world, but their main hub was Scholomance, which was founded by kel'thuzad to recruit members into the cult. And the whole goal of the Naxxramas raid was to take out their founder. To get in, however, you had to pay a pretty hefty price. This was back when you had to attune or key for everything in the game. Luckily, this raid wasn't too bad though. You had to be at least honored with the Argent Dawn, a task which was made pretty easy with the whole Scourge Invasion event. And, depending on your reputation level, you just paid for entry like an amusement park. Now, I know you need to defeat this Lich Lord to save Azeroth, but we're gonna need a little cash first before we let you do that. At honored level, you had to give 60 gold, 5 arcane crystals, 2 nexus crystals, and 1 righteous orb. At revered, the gold cost was halved to 30, you gave 2 arcane crystals and 1 nexus crystal. And, at Exalted, I guess they trust you enough to save the world by giving you a freebie. But anyways, once you were attuned, you could finally enter the raid. It was located in the Eastern Plagueland zone, and to enter it, you went into a structure located directly below the necropolis to get teleported up. Some of you may know that the original planned way to enter it was through the Stratholme dungeon. There's a gate next to Baron Rivender's building, and through it laid Naxxramas. Blizzard, rightfully so, saw this as a bad idea though because it wouldn't be very fun to run 8 groups of 5 people through the dungeon every time you wanted to raid, so they just went with the Eastern Plaguelands route instead. There were similar systems for the Molten Core and Blackwing Lair though. You could gain access to the Molten Core raid through the Blackrock Depths, and the Blackwing Lair through the Blackrock Spire. And that made sense because it showed their actual physical locations. Of course, having the teleport option made things much more convenient though, and it was the preferred way to get there. Anyways, back on subject, Naxxramas. Just like the Wrath of the Lich King release, this raid had a whopping 15 bosses total, spread out across 5 wings. Back then, it was the Abomination Wing, and the Death Knight, Spider, and Plague Wings. Once you cleared every single boss in all of those wings, you gained access to the Frostworm Lair, which held the 2 final bosses, Sapphiron and kel'thuzad. The difficulty jump was quite extreme. The tuning back then was still in its early stages, and you would have bosses that were actually mathematically impossible to beat, even assuming the best gear and perfect performance from every single player in a 40-man raid. Like Cthulhu, the final boss from AQ40 for example, until he was patched at least. And Naxxramas was of course even a step up from that. With AQ40 at least, for some of the initial bosses, you could get away with some members having Molten Core gear, but for Naxxramas, you had to have each and every member decked out mainly in AQ40 gear with some pieces from Blackwing Lair. And every member had to be on top of their game. This raid finally introduced the Tier 3 armor sets, which were long overdue. The Blackwing Lair had Tier 2, and that was released nearly a year before Naxxramas. AQ40 had mini sets called Tier 2.5, but they weren't really true tier sets. They all looked quite nice, but it was still during the vanilla times to where they weren't really friendly to the unconventional specs at the time. For example, the warrior set was for tanking, so if you were a DPS warrior, you still had to look for offset pieces for your gear. There were a couple of interesting items found in this raid. You had the new legendary items for casters, Atiesh, and the awesome corrupted Ashbringer. These items have some interesting stories behind them, but it's a subject I've covered several times recently. If you're curious, I'll have a link in the description. Sorry to send you to 2 videos here, but I have covered them pretty thoroughly already. Now, it's pretty fuzzy for me since it's been like 10 years, but I think the easiest wing was the Spider Wing. This had the Anubricon, Grand Widow Fairlena, and the Makesna bosses, and it was generally the wing that most guilds went for first, including mine. I remember the Anubricon fight had a bug to where he would knock the tanks up into the air, and he would evade to full health, which was supremely frustrating. Like I said, the tuning was still in its infancy. But after that, I think most guilds went for any of the first bosses in the other wings. Resuvius for Death Knight, Noth for Plague Wing, and, if they had enough damage, Patchwork for the Abomination Wing. From then on, you really had to buckle up and bring your A game because each of these fights required it. My guild was number 2 on Alliance for my server, and we only got 6 or so bosses in before we hung it up and took a break for the Burning Crusade. The raid was released on June 20th, 2006, and the world first kel'thuzad kill was about 2.5 months after that by the guild Nihilum on the Magtheridon server. The US came a day later with the guild Risen on the Illyria server. Good job, guys. One of the reasons that this raid was difficult though, aside from the extreme difficulty obviously, was the timing. The next expansion, the Burning Crusade, had already been announced at this point, and it was common knowledge that the level cap would be increased and therefore any raid gear would get replaced pretty quickly. This put a huge roadblock in front of most raiding guilds at the time, and it really killed the motivation during the Naxxramas tier specifically. You gotta remember that a lot of guilds were still working on AQ40 when Naxxramas was released, since that raid was quite difficult as well. In fact, I'd say that the majority of the guilds didn't even start it until a couple months after the initial release date. The release date for the Burning Crusade was announced on the 28th of October, which was pretty much the kill shot for most guilds. The expansion was to be released in January of next year, 2007, so many people just hung it up, took a breather, and waited to start their journey to level 70 in the Outland. So, it was because of all of this that the raid was re-released in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion 2 years later. Blizzard said that the raid didn't really get the attention it deserved, so it became the first raid tier for World of Warcraft's second expansion. But along with that, it didn't really make sense to keep the original Naxxramas in the game, so it was removed. The new Naxxramas had basically the same fights with just a few alterations. The biggest one was that they were easier. But, aside from this reduced difficulty, you also had a cameo appearance from the Lich King himself to tie the story into the expansion. And the old Tier 3 models were updated to keep up with the visuals. And items such as Atiesh and the Corrupted Ashbringer were removed entirely, making them very rare collector's items these days. So, that's the old Naxxramas in a nutshell. It's probably up there on the list of the hardest raids of all time if you measure that by the amount of times it was cleared during the current raid tier. A very cool and interesting raid overall, and it's a shame that it wasn't seen by a lot of people during its original form. Since its removal, there's been a huge demand to bring it back though, since people want the old Tier 3 models and items such as the Corrupted Ashbringer and Atiesh. But from all Blizzard posts, supposedly it doesn't exist anymore, as the raid was overwritten, so to speak, by the Wrath of the Lich King version. There was speculation that you could access it pre-Cataclysm. People say that they just moved the necropolis under the ground, and if you use some TOS unfriendly tools, you could still reach it. However, when Cataclysm released, the old world was of course revamped, and they finally removed the hidden necropolis. Despite all of this, people still search for it even to this day, and it's considered to be the holy grail for all of the explorers out there. Personally though, I think Blizzard is telling the truth and it doesn't exist anymore. So, that's about it. That's all I can think of to talk about regarding this classic raid. I hope you enjoyed the nostalgia trip if you played WoW back then, or you learned some interesting things if you just picked up the game after the fact. I hope you found the video interesting, like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next episode of Time Warp. Peace.